Thank you, Rudy, and good morning, everyone. And again, thanks to the program committee for the invitation today. So as Rudy says, this is going to be a presentation about the environmental aspects, but specifically about power consumption of AI data centers. And yeah, okay, I've got a Nokia logo up there. I actually used to work for Infinera, who were bought by Nokia a few months ago. So that's how I've ended up with that Nokia logo on the slide. There are no Nokia products mentioned in this presentation. You'll be happy to know it's purely a tutorial presentation. And I thought the danger, as Rudy says, I keep on changing this slide deck. So one of the things you'll notice when you see the PDF is there are 57 slides in the PDF. I'm not going to present 57 slides. About half of those slides are hidden. So what I do, I kind of rejiggle the deck each time I present it. I add new slides. And unfortunately, the next slide is one that I've just added to this deck. And I'm thinking, I'm going to go over time with this slide because there's so much so many implications of this next slide. And that is a timeline of the Spanish blackout. All right? Because I think from time to time, there's an expression in English, read the tea leaves. You know, you make a cup of tea, that instead of using a tea bag, you use ordinary loose tea. And in the old days, they used to look at the tea leaves at the end of the cup, and they'd make fortune telling, right? So you've got to read the tea leaves, I think, when it comes to the impact of certain aspects on power grids. So let's just get a little bit of background. Spain has focused its energy sector on solar and wind. Nothing wrong with that. That's a very good thing to do. But in 2019, the Spanish government decided that they were going to phase out their nuclear power plants, right? And of course, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. And suddenly, everyone thinks, oh, shit. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Maybe that might not be the best thing. So, of course, now they're under pressure to maybe reverse that decision. And, oops. Oh, okay, it's showing crinkle down here, but it shows up okay here, which is the right-wing People's Party managed to get that decision reversed. And they saw the mistake that Germany made, basically, in closing down their nuclear plants and suddenly very reliant on Russian gas and also continuing to burn coal, right? So the reason I've put that to one side, we should never allow politics or popular opinion to affect energy strategy. You might say, oh yeah, the people wanted us to close down the nuclear power plants. You say, well, yeah, they wanted that last week, but this week they want Taylor Swift tickets, right? So popular opinion changes very quickly. So let's fast forward to April the 28th at 12:30 Central European summertime. What's happening in Spain? It's a beautiful sunny day. The energy mix in Spain is about 71% solar and wind. The rest of it comes a little bit of natural gas, a little bit of nuclear. And so then, if we look at Spain, they don't have a problem with the amount of power they can generate, right? That 32 gigawatts, that daily demand on that day, that was fairly typical. And Spain can generate 130 gigawatts of electricity. The problem is they closed down certain kinds of power plants. Natural gas was closed down because it's a sunny day and solar electricity is super cheap. They had closed down 4 out of their 7 nuclear plants. 1 was closed down for refueling, 3 were closed down because of the economics. And the problem was the electricity spot price on that day was slightly negative. In other words, you had to pay people to take your electricity. And in fact, Spain was exporting power to Andorra, France, Portugal, and Monaco through interconnectors. Europe is very well equipped with electricity interconnectors, absolutely vital to the European power grid. So, 3 minutes later, there is a complete grid failure. Almost 60 million people across Iberia in Portugal, Andorra, Spain, without power for anything between 10 and 24 hours. Now, the problem is, I can't tell you why that happened. I'm not going to stand up here and say it's because of whatever, because you can imagine if you're involved in any way in the Spanish grid at the moment, you are trying to cover your backside. And the investigators are going to have to try and work very hard to find out why it happened. Because a lot of people will be hoping they don't find out. But I'm going to take a guess here. Look, power grids operate with alternating current. The alternating current runs at 50 hertz, and it has to stay at 50 hertz within a very tight band. At 0.3% variation, stuff starts happening. You start to close down entire sections of the grid, brownouts, blackouts. You start to take certain power plants offline. Nuclear plants are told to go offline. These are automatic events, and they're triggered by that variation. So Spain experienced this grid instability because they have a lot of solar and wind. But Denmark doesn't experience instability. They have a lot of wind, a little bit of solar. Germany doesn't experience instability. They have a lot of solar and wind. There was something that Spain is doing wrong. Now, look, again, we don't have the real reason why. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you why. But my prediction is we are going to hear the word inertia a lot when all of these investigations finally report. And inertia is the big spinning generators that are powered by coal, gas, oil, nuclear, hydroelectric, pumped hydro. These are all examples where you get the big spinning generators. And that inertia, when you take their power sources away, they keep spinning for like 10 minutes. And it gives the power companies time to deal with problems and shuffle things around. When you have renewables in the grid, a large proportion, and not enough inertia in the rest of the grid, that's when you get into instability problems. Anyway, like I said, I could talk for a long time on that slide. Why did I start with it? Well, national power grids are already under stress, dealing with intermittent renewables that are generating DC. They don't always cope very well. And the appearance of gigawatt-scale AI data centers is only going to make that worse. And I'll give you some examples of how not to, I think not to do it. But so let's start with this general question. Will our AI actually be good for the environment? Well, Bill Gates says, yeah, it is. It's no problem. So, that's fine. We can just take his word for it. But I would suggest he's perhaps not the most unbiased commentator on this, right? There are organizations that are already raising issues. The growth in global electricity demand accelerating because of AI. There's also this idea of what's it going to do to climate goals? A lot of companies are reneging on their climate commitments because they say, oh, actually, we're just going to pause that. We can't pause climate change. And also, look in the rest of the slide deck. I do talk about water consumption for AI data centers. And the other thing I'll highlight to you, when you look through the PDF, there are links to all sorts of reports. And I've tried to choose, whenever you read a report, you have to say, who is that writing it? What's their agenda? I've tried to choose reports that perhaps are in both sides of the agenda and also somewhere in the middle. Very difficult to be sure if you're getting unbiased information. Why are we rushing headlong into this AI future? It's basically because a small number of very rich people are seeing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And in order to grasp that opportunity, they have to build massive AI data centers. And the clue is simple. It's about the money. And increasingly, as the AI market expands beyond the sort of the hyperscalers, it's about FOMO, fear of missing out. Companies who say, everyone else seems to be using this AI stuff. Maybe we should be using it as well. So, okay, but why now? Now, one of the best papers I read in my research for this, I started this journey last year. I found this paper online by somebody called L.M. Poe. Now, the link is down there on the bottom left. It looks like a graduate paper. It's a brilliant history of AI. If you're looking for a really good free resource to find out about the history of AI. I recommend it. And here we see this magic happening. In 2017, a paper by Google that described a transformer architecture. You're going to hear more about this. I've seen several other presentations on the agenda about AI. But out comes a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And Sam Altman, who's brilliant, so he's the CEO of OpenAI, and he's brilliant in interviews. He's obviously had lots of media training. He's a very savvy guy. And he comes up with these two things. Look, if you ask me why it worked, in 3 words, I'll say deep learning worked. In 15 words, deep learning worked, it got better with scale, and we dedicated increasing resources to it. Now, what he means by that final bit is we keep on building bigger and bigger data centers. So what then happens is you have an emerging ecosystem, people who build the picks and shovels, the NVIDIAs of this world, and then you get the AI models appearing. Then you get the companies who figure out what you can do with it, applications like customer service applications, human resources applications. And then you get the integrators that tell you how to actually implement it in your environment. And then at the base there, you've got the companies who are building these massive buildings, huge amounts of concrete, steel, wiring, and so on. So what we also see is a massive investment on the part of the hyperscalers. Now, there have been a few concerns about Microsoft maybe stepping back from that investment. From what the analysts can tell, I'm not an expert here, but I read what the analysts are saying, and they say that actually they're just shuffling things around. They're allowing some leases on data centers to end, and they're building new data centers. And of course, at the back of all of this, we've got the Stargate project. You look at what's being built in Texas, in Abilene, the scale of that data center is absolutely enormous. And that's the first phase of Stargate. So what we already see is a massive increasing forecast for AI revenues. And so when people look at that, they think there's money to be made here, right? And so it's a self-perpetuating event. So data centers are getting bigger. Now, I'm going to give you some examples here. At least one of them is from China. The data you get from China can't always be trusted. You can kind of cross-check it with measuring satellite images of the size of data centers. But anyway, the purpose is just to show the increase in scale. Because back in 2013, see, I work in optical transmission. And we got involved with the Luleå project because Luleå in Sweden is in the middle of nowhere. It's got nice cold air to cool the data center, got lots of hydroelectric power, but there's no people there. So you actually need to bring all of that information into the heart of Europe. So we got involved in those connections. Luleå is a 30 megawatt data center, and everyone said, wow, this isn't a building, this is a campus, it's just enormous. But today, the Inner Mongolia Information Park in China is 150 megawatts. It's 5 times the power consumption of Luleå. The biggest data center announced in South Korea is 3,000 megawatts. You're talking about a sizable city consuming 3,000 megawatts. So just a few basics about electricity. How does the world generate electricity? We've got very good data on this. This is our world in data. And what you see is, obviously, a growing demand for electricity. Okay, now we all know perhaps we ought to be economizing on the power that we consume. And if you look at a graph like that, you think, ooh, consumption's going up. I don't think we should be concerned about that. I think that's something we should celebrate. Because in my opinion, electricity equals prosperity. Try looking at somebody in a developing country and saying, nah, you can't have air conditioning. No, that's not allowed. That's not very fair, is it? So we should celebrate the fact that electricity is bringing a better lifestyle and more prosperity to countries around the world. The problem we need to focus on is how we generate that electricity. And when we look back over the last 40 years or so, I don't think we've done too well in terms of our decarbonization of the electricity system. If you look back at 1985, fossil fuels generated 63% of electricity. Or a couple of years ago, they generated 61%. That's a 40-year effort, right? We haven't done very well at decarbonizing the electricity sector. So I think we need to be far more focused on how we generate the power. And we don't compromise. There are some compromises that I'll warn you about later on. Now, power grids are a vital national asset. So you can think about them a little bit like a network, a little bit like the internet, because you've got lots of connections, and you've got things that are feeding the grid. So you've got power stations powered by coal, gas, nuclear, hydro. Coal, gas, and nuclear, they're just ways of boiling kettles. I mean, we go back to the 1800s and how you built steam engines. That's what you're really doing. Hydro is different, obviously, because you're using the water to drive turbines. We transmit that electricity at different voltages for efficiency. So higher voltages are more efficient for long-distance transmission, but higher voltages are very dangerous if they get close to the home. So you step down. As you get closer and closer to the people that use the electricity, you step down the voltages. So a normal user, like a town or a city, just connects into the distribution grid. Renewable installations, like solar and wind, they usually are relatively low power contributors. So they feed into the distribution grid level. And then you have storage systems like battery backups, so-called BESS systems, BESS systems, and pumped hydro. They have two-way connections because sometimes they need to charge up and sometimes they are giving power into the power grid. Very high demand users like gigawatt scale data centers connect directly into the high voltage side of the grid because they just need so much power. And the data centers might have local solar, wind, whatever. It's going to be a tiny fraction of what they actually need to run, but they often have a few solar panels on the roof. And that sort of is purely localized because they need connection to the power grid in order to satisfy most of their demand. So a key point is that a new city needs very high capacity grid connection, but a city takes decades to grow. So the power company has time to plan, to rearrange connections, to make investments at sensible interest rates, for example, and to plan for that city's demand. A data center can pop up in a matter of months, but with the same demand as a fully grown city. On day one, that data center is going to need 1 gigawatt of power. And classic power grids were not designed with intermittent DC power sources like renewables. They weren't designed for that. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. We can fix that. We can redesign them. The problem is when you get free market economics that decouples the price that you're paying for the electricity from the investment you have to make to use that electricity. That's a big problem. Anyway, now there are a lot of countries experiencing grid congestion issues, not grid instability issues like Spain experienced. These are congestion issues. These are where we want to connect to the grid, but the grid can't do it yet. I'll always use the United Kingdom as an example of don't do it that way, right? Don't do it the way the British are doing it. And that can apply in so many different ways. But in this particular context, there are over 1,100 renewable energy projects queued up. They're ready to go, but they can't connect to the grid. There are housing developments. Britain has a housing crisis. People are building homes, except they can't connect them to the power grid. That's a little bit of a problem. And so, this is this just a British problem? No, in America, they have big problems with this. And all across Europe as well, by the way. This is a graph of wind projects across Europe and the connection delays that they have because grids can't cope. The people who are running the grid say, look, maybe we could connect you, but we don't have all the mechanisms to keep it stable. Okay, luckily, so I flew here. So did I tick the little box that says plant some trees? Nah, because those boxes are nonsense, right? There are lots of studies that basically say, look, that was a fantastic idea. But you know, it turns out, and I don't know whether you know this, human beings are quite dishonest. And when you have an unregulated market and there's an opportunity for somebody to get some government money, oddly enough, they tend to rig the rules. And they, you know, oh, it doesn't matter if we sell that tree 3 or 4 times, does it? It doesn't matter if we assume that that tree is 15 years old the day that we plant it and has grown into something that actually will remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Those things don't matter, surely. So anyway, but the thing is, it's all very well on an individual basis, but there's something much more sinister here. This is some data from Australia. And the 2 parameters there, so the orange bars are the number of carbon credit type schemes that are being sold. That's increasing. Fantastic. Except the blue line are the number of starts on renewable energy projects. That's decreasing. And there's definitely, well, the conclusions of this report basically say that why would you bother to use real clean energy when you can just buy some virtual clean energy? And honestly, we're now seeing a number of people becoming increasingly concerned that big companies are choosing clean energy credits. Now, it should be a short-term plaster, you know, sticking plaster. It should be a short-term thing while you are figuring out your longer-term investments in green energy. But actually, it seems to be increasingly the case that they're using clean energy credits as excuses and also as ways of trying to fulfill their commitments on clean energy in their corporate sustainability reports. So I just want to pause. I've made a few statements here. Let's look at a couple of case studies. In Virginia, in the United States, this is an area that has the biggest concentration of data centers in the world. So it's an enormous market, and I'm sure some of you are involved in connections one way or another. My focus, by the way, is on submarine networks, and so a lot of transatlantic cables go directly or indirectly into the Virginia data center area. It's had a 30% compound annual growth rate since 2014, with a total of 4 gigawatts of power today. Now, that growth is continuing. It's not letting up. There's still a lot of demand. So what do they need to satisfy the growing demand? Well, they say they need 11 gigawatts of new data center capacity. Well, that's 40% of the whole state's peak demand today. So that's not an inconsiderable amount of power. How do they get there? Well, we need to build 10 to 15 gigawatts of firm generation capacity, not renewables. They're talking about coal, gas, or nuclear. Why is that a challenge? Well, gas is probably the favored option that they'll look at. It can take 3 to 4 years to get a combined cycle gas power station approved, a 1 gigawatt station. They need 15 of those. And the problem is, the companies that would build those gas-fired power stations, they're saying, the problem is, when I build my gas-fired power station, and as I see elsewhere, a lot of the times you're not even paying me for the electricity it produces. You're telling me to shut it down because the renewables are generating energy, and you're taking the energy from the renewables instead of me. How am I going to get a return on my investment? So there's a lot of pushback from those companies saying that they'll never get their investment back. So it's also a wasted effort if you cannot connect to the grid. The problem is at the moment, data centers in Virginia, if you haven't forecast that data center, you could have a 7-year wait for connection into the grid. And so what's happening is companies are bring your own power, BYOP. You buy some trailers and with massive generators on them, and you bring them to the data center. And let's look at an example of this: the Colossus data center from XAI in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, you know, the one thing we can rely on with Elon Musk, he's always going to get on with the local people, right? He's not the kind of guy that would ever annoy people. Well, today, his goal was to build a 100,000 node data center, 100,000 H100 GPUs, scaling to 200,000. And this was predominantly for Tesla's self-driving car AI. Now, 100,000 H100s needs 150 megawatts. So, I'm sure people in this room would have been involved in data center planning. I guess one of the things you say is, how much power is available at that location? Well, the Colossus site was a former Electrolux factory that used to make white goods, things like refrigerators and washing machines. Turns out you don't need a lot of power to make those, comparatively, because it only had 8 megawatts of power coming into the plant. So what did Elon do? He basically hired 14 of these natural gas-powered mobile generators, parks them at the site and starts running them. That's only 35 megawatts. We're still a long way short. So he gets another 4 of these 64 megawatt generators from solar turbines. Oh, thank goodness we've got some renewable energy. Oh, hang on, it's just the name of the company. They're powered by natural gas. Oops. Now, obviously behind the scenes, he's wanting real electricity coming in. But the substation was only 8 megawatts. So, of course, the power company says, well, oh yeah, by the way, the smog levels in Shelby County are already regularly above recommended levels. This is before Elon arrived. I'll give you some data on that in the next slide. But the local power company agreed to upgrade the substation to 50 megawatts. And that was going to be at local taxpayer expense. But XAI said, no, we'll fund a 150 megawatt substation. It cost us $24 million, we'll fund it. I mean, you would have thought they'd get that done before they moved in, but no. Now, the thing is, that's a substation. Substations don't generate electricity. They're just a connection point. It's just like buying a bigger router. You know, you're basically buying a bigger connection point. You're not generating the data from the router. But where does the power actually come from? And Tennessee actually still has a fair bit of coal power generation, has a fair bit of gas, it has some nuclear, it has a mix of power, and it has renewables as well. But the general consensus from the Southern Environmental Law Center, which is a local action group, they say, look, the grid's already overloaded. Now, I've paraphrased them, because they're lawyers, the actual quote was about, half a page long, but that was the gist of it. We don't have enough power generation at the moment. Well, you would think that Elon would say, fair enough, I will sort of look somewhere else. But he's saying, nah, I want to expand Colossus. I want 1 million GPUs instead of 100,000 GPUs on that site. Now, the local people are not happy. He's been accused of polluting they're relatively poor communities. And remember, data centers don't bring any local wealth. You've got 3 guys running this data center, so it's not like it produces jobs. They always import the construction workers, so you don't even get the jobs then. So XAI has filed for permits for 15 gas turbines, didn't bother waiting for approval, and actually is operating 35 gas turbines. And they say, oh, we don't run them all at once, except they see the power. People have got drones with infrared cameras. They can see the heat blooms from the individual generators. So according to the SELC, these emit between 1,200 and 2,000 tons of nitrogen oxides. Ignore the CO2. And by the way, this is a really inefficient way to burn natural gas. Ignore the CO2. It's the nitrogen oxides. They create the smog that blights that area. How does that really compare? Well, the Valero oil refinery emits 342 tons of nitrogen oxides. These are all in Tennessee. The Draslovica chemical plant is 743 tons. Memphis International Airport. International airports are one of the highest emitters of nitrogen oxides. That only generates 1,000 tons. So this data center is like a couple of major international airports in terms of its nitrogen oxide emission. And where are they going to get the power from? The rumor has it, he's looking for another 40 to 90 gas turbine generators. There's a link to that article there. And you know, this is how not to build a mega data center. So how should we power AI data centers? Well, maybe we should look at what the data center operators really want. Well, clearly they want gigawatt scale. And here are some examples of cities that consume about a gigawatt of power, including Amsterdam. They want 24/7, 365 supply. The data centers don't sort of pause when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. So things like coal, gas, nuclear, these are 24/7, 365 power sources. Solar and wind are intermittent. Hydro, geothermal, tidal, wave, they've got various problems. They're usually very location dependent. You may not have access to them. And remember, if there's a 7-year wait to connect to the power grid, you won't be able to reach those sources. You want, in fact, a compact installation of your power, because instead of connecting to the grid, just build the power station next to the data center. That is what Stargate is doing in Abilene, Texas. That massive data center, which will be a 1.2 gigawatt data center when it's finished, has a natural gas power station being built next to it. Do we really want to build more natural gas power stations? Because low CO2 emission, I believe, has become optional. Google set a goal to become carbon neutral by 2030. They set that goal, I think, in 2020. But in reality, they've got a 48% increase in CO2 emissions since they made that commitment. Microsoft made a fantastic commitment, remove all the CO2 that the company has ever put into the environment since it was founded. Now, originally, I think that was by 2030. They've shifted that to 2050. But since they made that commitment, they've increased their CO2 output by 29%. It's not going in the right direction, is it? So what about batteries? So batteries, the battery energy storage systems, BESS systems. On the right-hand side here, you can see a graph showing the price per kilowatt hour for battery technology and how that has dropped over the last 10, 15 years. It's an amazing success story. The price of batteries now is so insanely cheap. Now, fair enough, we used to be worried that they contain cobalt and nickel. No, if you buy a lithium iron phosphate battery, there's no cobalt or nickel in that battery. Now, there may be some other, there's like bits of silver in there. There's definitely some elements that we need to be a little bit worried about scarcity, but the kind of human exploitation problems that cobalt has, no, I don't think lithium iron phosphate batteries suffer from that. However, the largest of these BESS systems in the world is the Edwards and Sanborn Solar and Energy Storage Project in California. There's a link to that project there. 4,660 acres. I'll put it in the international standard unit of 3,530 football fields. In other words, it's quite true. It's quite big. I think that was soccer, actually. I should have said soccer. Well, no, football. That has the equivalent of 864 megawatts of solar PV. 864 megawatts. So the biggest in the world isn't even a gigawatt. But maybe the battery storage is huge. Well, it has 3,287 megawatt hours of battery storage. So for a gigawatt power data center, that would last about 3 hours. And the largest of these BESS systems in the world, which is in Belgium, would last about 40 minutes for a gigawatt scale data center. So, and also, look at the amount of land it takes. It's insane. The other problem I see, solar panel waste. It costs between $20 and $30 to recycle a solar panel. That's getting worse, by the way, because the cheaper that solar panels become, the more difficult they are to recycle. And also, what what does it mean when you say recycle? If you just grind up the solar panel and put it into road filler, does that count as recycling? Apparently it does. But that's not what we really want from recycling. We want to pull out the silver, the indium tin oxide that's in the solar panel. Well, it only costs $2 to send it to landfill. Now, in a free market economy, which do you think they choose? Fortunately, the European Union has made a mandate. Solar panel manufacturers, when they sell these solar panels, they have to make provision to take them back and recycle them. Now, what recycle means, I don't know, but it's a step in the right direction. Lithium battery recycling, I could not find reliable data on this. It's anywhere between 5% and 59% of batteries are recycled. And honestly, the spread is that wide. I don't know how reliable the data really is. Again, they're quite difficult to recycle. And one of the biggest problems is EVs. And it's not because EVs are bad. EVs, as many people will know, they're a fantastic driving experience. I would say better than a petrol-powered car. And the battery packs in them, this is the problem. If an EV is involved in an accident and the insurance company asks the garage, they say, is there any visible damage to the battery pack? And the garage looks and they say, actually, there's a bit of a scratch on the battery pack there, probably a stone that got thrown up against the battery pack as it was driving along. Absolutely no problem. Yeah, there is visible damage. The insurance company says, okay, write the car off. That battery pack is then, I'm talking about the country with best practice, the United Kingdom. That battery is taken to a fireproof warehouse somewhere in the middle of the UK. It's just put on a shelf. And one of the problems is that most battery manufacturers do not reveal the internal workings of the battery, except Nissan. Nissan has open sourced the Leaf battery packs. So you will see now, because the Leaf had a notoriously short battery life when it was first released, one of the first EVs. So, but now you can upgrade your Leaf EVs. There's a cottage industry that's forming of small companies maintaining those battery power packs because they've got the diagnostics to find out of the 10,000 cells in that battery pack, which 2 are damaged, right? Because that's normally what happens with a battery pack. Anyway, have to move on. So the power options for AI data centers. Let's get all the options on the table and start looking at them. Well, if we want gigawatt scale, unfortunately, tidal and wave, you can't build them at gigawatt scale. If you want 24/7, 365, it's surprising. Coal and hydro are crossed off the list. Turns out coal-fired power stations, very much like Italian sports cars, spend a lot of time in the garage, right? And hydro, the reservoirs are not always full. So, they don't always run. Wind, of course, and solar, they're intermittent anyway. You'd expect that, but I think it's surprising with coal and hydro. Compact, how much land do they take up? Well, hydro takes up a lot of land if you include the reservoir side. Solar and wind take up enormous amounts of land, so does coal. Mainly because they put the coal ash, they dump it right next to the power station. And they use a lot of land when they do that. And just as a matter of interest, which do you think has more radiation coming from it? A nuclear power station or the slag heap next to a coal-fired power station? Coal comes from underground. There's a lot of radioactive elements underground, and when you burn the coal, you end up with those radioactive elements in the slag. The difference is there's no regulation to measure that. Whereas there is in a nuclear power station, you're not allowed to emit radiation from a nuclear power station. And then finally, what about the CO2 equivalent emissions? And again, there's no surprise there. But what we see is 2 different technologies, which are nuclear and geothermal. And so there's no coincidence that when you look across the plans that hyperscalers like Google and Meta, Microsoft, they've made public commitments to nuclear and geothermal. No surprise. What about the materials used? Well, again, if we look at all the different materials, this things like cement, concrete, glass, steel, and then other, nuclear uses a lot of cement, but if you then normalize that by the amount of electricity that's produced, nuclear is actually one of the lowest consumers of those materials. Solar photovoltaic uses a lot of power per gigawatt hour, and most importantly, that orange wedge, other, it's things like silver, lithium, cadmium, various other fairly rare elements on the planet. Water consumption, that's the other way. Nuclear and geothermal are the worst in terms of water consumption. But it depends what kind of nuclear you're talking about. More on that later. Geothermal is a fascinating technology. You think, oh, this is great. We've got hot rocks under the ground. Why don't we just generate steam from the hot rocks? Well, actually, in places like Iceland, United States, Indonesia, Turkey, Kenya, Italy, they generate power because those hot rocks are not just under the ground, they're actually trying to get out. so they're quite easy to get to. And conventional geothermal generates about 1% of global electricity today. But it only works in certain regions. If only there was a way to make it more widely accessible. So we have enhanced geothermal that uses fracking techniques. Now, how comfortable do we feel about fracking? Right? But bear in mind that a lot of this is driven in the United States, and they just seem to accept fracking. I'm not sure why, but anyway, enhanced geothermal uses fracking techniques to fracture the ground under the earth, pump water down, the water gets heated up, and you generate steam. What could possibly go wrong? So the advantages of enhanced geothermal, potentially low CO2, notice the little asterisk there. Turns out when you drill holes in the ground, sometimes carbon dioxide comes out because it's stored under the ground. And the thing is, because America is not a signatory of the Kyoto Treaty, they don't measure it. They're not required to measure it. Most other countries that signed the Kyoto Treaty would measure the CO2. One of the things, by the way, geothermal, it can run 24/7. It's got a relatively small footprint. A really important thing, the skill sets match the oil and gas industry. If you are trying to phase out industries like oil and gas, what about the people who work in those industries? What do they do? If they could be moved into an industry that has the same kind of pay rates and the same kind of skill sets, that would be a big advantage. We never did that for coal mining, by the way. There was almost no transfer of skills. So the disadvantages of enhanced geothermal, the potential emissions, not just CO2, but smelly gases like sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. Potential waste production. Turns out the water that you pump down, when it comes back up, it's like a muddy slurry. And it's not even nice. It's full of mildly toxic chemicals. Potential for seismic disturbances because of the fracking. And most designs are still at megawatt scale, very small numbers of megawatts. They potentially need a lot of water because you're pumping water down to generate the steam. And the new enhanced geothermal systems, they're an unproven technology at the moment. Now, this is a rapidly moving area. I've got 3 different reports at the top there, links to 3 different reports. Project Inner Space, they're very pro-geothermal. The IEA has often been criticized for promoting things like nuclear and coal and fossil fuels over renewables, including geothermal. So that's the other side of the equation. And then there's a report that's endorsed by the US academia from the Idaho National Laboratory. And so maybe that's an unbiased report. I don't know. So you've got 3 to choose from there. But the INL report says that you have the potential to create 100 gigawatts of new geothermal generation in the next 50 years at a cost of $600 to $900 million. Now, does that sound like a lot of money? It's cheap. That if you could get 100 gigawatts of low CO2 energy for $600 to $900 million, and it's quick to deploy, that's a bargain. And what you've all been waiting for, nuclear power. Now, I will say, Since I was a kid, I've been a big fan of nuclear power. So I was actually quite a fan of fusion. But of course, when I was, you can tell I'm not a kid anymore. It's a while ago that I started to read about nuclear fusion. And of course, it was 40 years that we'd have nuclear fusion. A little bit more than 40 years later, we are still about 40 years away from nuclear fusion. It's a really complicated thing, right? There's only one safe fusion generator that we're aware of, and it's 93 million miles away. So, and that's why it's safe, right? Because it's 93 million miles away. Nuclear plants seem like the perfect solution to AI data centers. Or maybe. So, nuclear may have issues, right? If we look in the United States, the first time I gave this presentation, it was actually in Georgia. It was in Atlanta, at NLUUG. And they just finished the Vogtle 3 and 4 nuclear plants. They come on stream. So this is fantastic. 4.5 gigawatts of zero CO2 power. This is fantastic. But the original time frame of 2017 slipped to 2025, an 8-year delay. And the budget was 2.6 times over its original budget. $37 billion, to the point where they're really worried that Georgia electricity customers are having to pay a lot more in their electricity bills to subsidize these plants. See, best practice, United Kingdom. Hinkley Point C in Somerset, 3.2 gigawatts of zero carbon electricity, fantastic. The original time frame of 2025 has slipped to 2029 to 31. You know, it's been a real mess, actually, Hinkley C. The budget has now risen to $56 billion, 4 times the original budget, okay? The European Commission got involved in this because at the time, we were still within the European Union, and there was a problem because we'd agreed, because we'd let EDF build this thing, we had agreed that they were able to sell the electricity at a certain price. And the European Commission said, that price is so high, it will distort European electricity markets. Good job we left the European Union, isn't it, really? Anyway, not an ideal case. So, why don't we look at France, the poster child for successful nuclear power, a country that generates between 65 and 70% of its electricity from nuclear. Flamanville 3, a 1.65 gigawatt reactor, again, you know, gigawatt scale, fantastic. The original time frame of 2012, it's not running even now, right? It slipped to, they hope to get it running this year, 13 years late. But luckily, was it on budget? Not quite. 6 times over budget. It's still not as expensive as Hinkley C because when they started it so long ago, it was going to be really cheap. But now it's grown by a factor of 6. Not ideal. Now, why? If we look at each of these 3 countries and look at the last time that they built a large-scale nuclear reactor, we see in the United States, it was 1973. In Britain, it was 1988, and in France, it was 1991. We've essentially lost a generation of experience in building these plants. And the other thing is, we built them one at a time. The guy that was in charge of the Georgia project, he said, the biggest mistake that we made was only building 2. By the time we'd finished the second one, we'd figured out how to do it. And if we just carried on building them, they would have been at far lower cost and probably on time. Here's a fun fact. These are all 3 examples of pressurized water reactors. Where do all the pressurized water reactors in the world get their nuclear fuel from? Russia. It's a company called TVEL, which is a subsidiary of Rosatom. And yeah, Russia makes all this low-enriched nuclear fuel that is used in nuclear reactors, in pressurized water reactors. So does anybody actually still know how to build nuclear power stations? Well, in 2007, a guy called Vladimir Putin ordered a total integration of the 350 companies that were involved in the Russian supply chain for nuclear power. And he created a conglomerate called Rosatom. Now, imagine you are an unaligned country. You've got no nuclear experience, but you have a desire to deploy nuclear energy. But nuclear seems really complicated, potentially dangerous. What would you do? If you approached the USA or France or Korea, these are all three countries that build nuclear reactors. They have their own nuclear reactor technology. For example, Google is working with a company called Elemental for nuclear reactor projects. Because Google doesn't know how to build nuclear reactors, Elemental actually doesn't know how to build nuclear reactors, but they're acting as the prime contractor for the deal. They're bringing together all the different skill sets. And the problem is, things like site planning, finance, project management, personnel training, operational support, fuel supply, waste management, these are all serious questions. And if you go to a Western country for your nuclear power station, it's either your problem or let me introduce you to these partners. And we wonder why nuclear power stations go over budget and over the timescale. Because you've got so many different companies involved with so many legal agreements on something that is considered a very high-risk project. You could imagine how much money is wasted on legal bills, just administering contracts. So, why don't you go to Rosatom? It's a one-stop shop. The entire thing, soup to nuts, not just for fuel, but also site planning, importantly, finance. You can get all your finance for this from the Russian government. Rosatom does the whole thing. The problem is they still have a very Soviet attitude towards secrecy. I think it was in 2017, there was a release of some radioactive ruthenium, which is used as a tracer element for, ironically, it's used as a safety tracer element. If you detect it, you know that there's a leak somewhere. And there was a big leak of it in the production plant, and they said, there's no leak. But yeah, apparently there was. Other countries have huge ambitions. China has 57 operational reactors, 28 under construction. They have a goal to build 150 reactors by 2040, replace all of their coal-fired plants by 2060. This is genuine ambition, right? This is what people complain about, that China burns a lot of coal. All of the solar panels that you buy from China, they're probably made using coal-fired electricity in the production process. Same with the lithium batteries from China. 22 countries in COP28 pledged to triple nuclear output. This is a really big step forward, except there's a lot of political celebration. I don't see much action. None of these countries seem to have a plan. Now, the hyperscalers do have plans. Amazon famously purchased a data center next to a nuclear plant, the Susquehanna nuclear plant. They've got small modular reactor plans. Google, geothermal investments, and plans for small modular reactors. Microsoft have clean energy agreements. Yeah, okay. And then they're also restarting the reactor that didn't go pop at 3 Mile Island. Now, 3 Mile Island is a very emotive place, but actually nobody died at 3 Mile Island. Nobody was exposed to huge amounts of radiation. Oh, by the way, Microsoft is also very optimistic. They've got a deal with a company called Helion for a fusion reactor, which is, again, I could probably give a half-hour presentation about that. Oracle is talking about a 130,000 node data center, and they are looking at small modular reactors. And then Meta had plans to build a data center near to a nuclear reactor, a bit like Amazon was trying, but it was blocked because they discovered a rare species of bee, environmental issues. Now, I'm not going to trivialize that. We have to take account of the whole environment. All that Facebook has to do is find somewhere else that doesn't have a rare species of bee, right? It's not that hard. And they have an agreement for geothermal. So what's a small modular reactor? I'll just go through this fairly briefly. It's a small reactor being small, it's supposed to be easier to build, and the idea is you could churn them out in a factory and basically do the installation on site. So you have much tighter control of your production process, and you just kind of run these things off a production line. And they're small enough to co-locate with the data center, and they generate enough power that they can power the data center. And if you need more of them, like Elon, instead of him getting a whole bunch of new natural gas trailers, why wouldn't he just get some more small modular reactors? Again, there's a Danish company called Copenhagen Atomics that builds a reactor the size of a trailer, a semi-trailer, as they'd call it in America. So in a world of joined-up thinking, you would think that nuclear is quite complicated, so why don't we just choose one or two designs? We test the heck out of them, and then we just crank them out. That would be the logical approach, in my opinion. Are we actually doing that? Well, let's take a look. This is a selection of companies that are building 60 or more small modular reactor designs around the world. I've got a glossary of terms for the different kinds of reactor, and they're in different phases. Operational reactors, there are operational SMRs. In China, a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor, and 2 reactors in Russia. One of them is actually on a barge. They can move it around to mining towns in Siberia to provide power. And those are reactors that they've developed from their nuclear-powered icebreakers. And the reason that they can get them so small, that's highly enriched uranium. It's not normal uranium. Under construction, we've got a couple of different designs in China, one of which uses my favorite nuclear fuel cycle. And the fact that I have a favorite nuclear fuel cycle probably means that I need to get out more. But they're using thorium in a molten salt reactor. And if anyone wants to know why that's a good thing, have a chat to me. I'm coming to the dinner this evening. So, Russia's got a lead-cooled fast spectrum reactor. We've got a PWR in Argentina, which may or may not get finished. And then another couple of different designs of pressurized water reactors in Russia. Licensed. You have to license nuclear reactors, but you can only do that after you've finished the design completely. Licensed in at least one country. There's a pressurized water reactor in Korea, another PWR in America from a company called NuScale. They are the only US company. Oh, actually, are they? No, Kairos. So NuScale are the only US company that has a license for a production reactor. Why the hyperscalers are not banging on their door, I don't know. The first reactor they tried to build was for a private project, and it ran out of money. Kairos has only got permission for a demonstrator, not the full thing. Then you've got seeking a license, and then you've got a lot of companies in design. There's so many of them, and the journey from in design to production could be 10 years or more because of all of the regulations. What about nuclear waste? And remember, whenever you draw nuclear waste, always choose a picture of rusty barrels that are leaking some kind of green glowing liquid. Nuclear waste, okay. I think it's the safest kind of industrial waste. Why do I think that? Because I can buy a $35 Geiger counter from AliExpress that is perfectly functional, and it will tell me if there's any radiation around. If I'm breathing in toxic gas right now, how do I know? Carbon monoxide is a good example. You can buy a cheap little detector. But if it's anything complicated, it's a $1,000 laboratory test that takes a week. Nuclear waste is amazing. And also, the longer you leave it, the safer it gets. So one option, just bury it underground. Finland has a deep repository. You could also reprocess it. There's an idea. It turns out that most of the nuclear fuel rod that you pull out of a reactor is still useful fuel, about 95% of it. You could use a fast neutron reactor to turn it back into real usable fuel. But isn't it dangerous? Well, there are a lot of organizations that argue that it's dangerous. And if you look across the years, yes, we've had some incidents. So 3 Mile Island, nobody died. The amount of radiation release was about the same as taking a flight from Boston to San Francisco. It wasn't a lot of radiation. In fact, 3 Mile Island is a case study on how safe nuclear power is. Now, Chernobyl, yeah, okay. That's slightly different because it was built by the Soviets and they didn't put a containment building around it. If they'd just done that, we wouldn't even be talking about it. And then you have Fukushima. It's like one guy died and he was the guy that refused to leave his post. Very brave man. He was trying to help. He refused to leave his post in the reactor, and he died about 7 years later from lung cancer. He was a heavy smoker, but so it's not clear how much the accident contributed. But so following the Fukushima reactor incident, the Germans decided to close down their nuclear plants. And there's a report that says about 1,100 additional deaths happen in Germany every year because they close down their nuclear plants. A NASA report thinks that 1.8 million people are alive on the planet today that wouldn't have been if we didn't have nuclear power. They would have died from coal pollution and gas pollution. So, 3 steps, these last couple of slides, 3 steps for hyperscalers to take now. Number 1, grab any spare capacity on existing nuclear power stations. There are examples of companies doing that. And the amazing thing is, until recently, there were reactors in the United States that were about to close down for economic reasons. I can't believe that's the case, as recently as 2022. That's a free market problem. You restart any mothballed reactors that are not too far gone. Palisades in Michigan will be the first. 3 Mile Island will probably be the second. Germany has shut down 11 plants, probably the safest nuclear plants in the world because they're operated by German engineers. But the lady that is the CFO of E.ON, she says there's no economic way back. And one of the reasons is they were closed for political reasons, not for technical reasons. 3 Mile Island was mothballed for economic reasons, and so it can be easily restarted without any resistance. The German public will, resist the restart of nuclear power. Option 3, build some more nuclear power plants, if you remember how. And the US has a big goal, no plan to get there. Develop new kind of reactors, but that's very long term. And you also have to hope that somebody figures out nuclear fusion at some point. So we could assume that nuclear power is very expensive. Only Russia and China have plans to build on a large scale. It's got a very bad image. So maybe it's not a general purpose option for the world, right? But we're not talking about a general purpose option. We're talking about hyperscalers who have insane amounts of money. They want to build AI data centers, and if there's no way to power them, they're going to be very upset. So nuclear isn't just the best option for them, it's really the only option. And I think if they pay for the problems of nuclear to be solved, we could all benefit from the dream of cheap, safe, clean energy. Now, there's a Forbes article that you could look at this. It's actually called Narcissistic Altruism. I'm not saying the hyperscalers are good, right? They're just doing this accidentally. Now, final slide. We've got this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and the hyperscalers are rejoicing. But we need better AI. And you can think of better AI in a couple of different ways. Absolute terms and relative terms, right? Absolute terms, you need to meet certain standards, like for medical AI. Relative terms, I've got to have a better AI than Microsoft. Better means more processing power, and more processing power implies more electrical power. Well, what about those stupid corporate sustainability goals that we actually published a few years ago? Renewables are not a great fit. Over 80% of solar panels are made in China, usually coal-fired electricity making them. Over 70% of EV batteries in China. So we were only kidding. Let's just get some natural gas-powered trailers and power the station that way. So the consequences, obviously, are very bad. But some people have a plan B. Let's go to Mars. Well, actually, it's not really us, is it? None of us here are getting an invitation to Mars. It's them. Anyway, let's look on the bright side. Nuclear seems like a great option, but we forgot how to build nuclear stuff. Well, not everybody forgot, right? And now we think, but AI provides a massive productivity boost. Think on the bright side. Well, yeah, but we all lose our jobs, right, to robots and AI. And Amazon then say, hang on a second, if everybody's lost their job, who buys our stuff? That's called the AI dilemma. And there was somebody that thought about this, Plutarch, back in the 1st century CE. An imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. For 2,000 years, we've struggled with wealth inequality and not figuring it out. We were doing ever so well until about 20 or 30 years ago, and then we've just gone worse. Maybe AI can help us figure it out. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Well, being the introducer, I got the opportunity to make the final remark. I was wondering when Elon is going to go build his data center on Yellowstone National Park. Is that an option?
Well, yeah, but they also, I mean, Yellowstone, there's a geyser park in California that's actually the biggest geothermal station in the world. And so he could do that. He wouldn't put it in California, obviously, because he hates California, the taxation laws and things. But yeah, you're right. I mean, why not look at those? But there is that slight problem, isn't there? There's a dormant volcano.
Yeah, I was coming to that in the next point.
So I don't know. I mean, I think he's looking at other options.
Thanks a lot. Great talk. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you.